The next step in our process is to consider how agency and media are related. That is to have a look at how the identities that we author for ourselves and the way that we exert some kind of influence over who we want to be and over our destinies is related to how we use media. And then the next thing I want to do is talk about how Velez's research emerges from a long history about how people have used media and other forms of communication to author their own gendered identities. And I think that one of the things that we can see by the end of this video is how the extremely uncomfortable and upsetting topic of revenge porn can actually be related to cultural circumstances that are far more familiar and far more everyday. So, firstly, when we talk about agency related to media, what are we talking about? Well, I suppose the first thing is that we're talking about how people become socially active, people become figures who do things, take control of their world through controlling two things: discourse and technology. And this is really what Velez's research on revenge porn is about. It's about how women who live in circumstances where they are um, vulnerable to representations and the damage that representations from other people causes them, and how they can actually at least fight back against that through discourse and technology. And by discourse and technology, I mean the way that we think about and define social problems. And one of the things that Velez talks about is the way that the topic of online pornography, revenge pornography, um, is somewhere where women have used the online space to resist and fight back against dominant ideas about what revenge porn represents and why it happens. So what they're trying to do is change the discourse on revenge porn, change the way that we think about what that represents, and change the way that we understand who is responsible within the topic of revenge porn. And then certainly technology as well. Obviously, we're talking about how new media technologies have an influence over how we can express the identities that we want to have. Now, this occurs very obviously in relation to social media. Again, it's a cliche that we often hear, the idea that social media have expanded the public conversation simply by letting more voices in. And again, cliches are cliches because they're true. That does represent a significant shift in public culture that needs to be recognized. But I suppose one of the things that I was interested in doing was pulling out one of Velez's really interesting comments on agency and unpacking it because it's a little bit complicated. So, what she's interested in doing in looking at how women have fought back against the phenomenon of revenge pornography is she is, quote, locating agency within the kinetic energy of performances, which means accounting for the multiple interactions with humans, technologies, discourses, and other objects a single photograph experiences and the subsequent transformations of both image and subject undergo. So, what's she talking about here? Well, she's talking about, firstly, a particular form of alienation. She's talking about a phenomenon whereby people who've been the subject of revenge porn have had their images taken um, and placed into a different market of distribution where they suffer because they hold no control over who consumes their image and who profits from their image um, and who makes use of their image and why. And what she's talking about is how the online space allows women to um, to engage in what she calls a kinetic energy of performance, which means that the way that women are kind of moved to do something, to intervene in the way that that images which may or may not have been consensual are suddenly given a different meaning because they are circulated in a different way. And it's really an attempt to use the online space to recover agency over the meaning of those images. So, what we're essentially talking about here is a form of agency where people fight back against, from a position of powerlessness, where they've had their images that were taken probably for private use, or and suddenly turned into a commodity which is sold on the open market and consumed by a general audience. And the question is, how do women fight back against that? How do they fight back against that? By using social media technologies to change the way that we understand those images, to create a different set of ideas around them. Now, in doing this, what women who fight back against revenge pornography are doing is actually engaging in a form of culture that people have been writing about for some time. And this is where we bring in theories of subculture. And what are theories of subculture about? Well, the book in the middle, Resistance Through Rituals, which I've asked you to read an excerpt from today, was a book that was concerned how young people, particularly in post-war Britain, used the language of style, that is blended music and fashion and media, to make sense of a really quite chaotic social circumstance. And what the basis of this book was that post-war Britain had experienced marked and undeniable social shifts. So the war had disrupted all kinds of conventional social relationships. So previously, before the war, people experienced fairly narrowly defined identities that were related to race, class, and gender. And people just kind of naturally thought that Britain was a white patriarchal society. And suddenly, after the war, that clearly wasn't true anymore. Britain was becoming multicultural. Gender relations had been disrupted by a war that had demonstrated that women were perfectly capable of doing quote unquote men's work. And also class mobility. People were no longer fixed in the same class situation as they were before. And what Resistance Through Rituals argued was that you began to see these tensions. So people had kind of moved into the post-war period knowing that they were kind of in a position where fixed identities around race, gender, and class were actually more fluid. So there was this sense that society was making people think about new ways of living, and therefore what you began to see were people in the media that they consumed, and in the fashion they consumed, and the music that they listened to, were quite obviously beginning to experiment with those ideas and experiment with different ways of being, to create different forms of identity through the way that they dressed, for example. So one of the key aspects of this particular period was the fluidity of gender. We have a few images here. To the left, we have the famous English model Twiggy from the 1960s. To the right, we have a singer called Susie Sue, who is the lead singer of Susie and the Banshees, a leading icon of the very influential British punk movement of the late 1970s. And what you would say about both of these images is that they are interesting as representations of youth subcultures that very much played around with images of androgyny. So, Twiggy is largely seen as being representative of a particular subcultural form that was very popular in the 1960s called mod culture. And Susie Sue obviously is a representation of punk culture. And what these two subcultures both, a characteristic of both of these subcultures, was the blending and blurring of gender identities. So if you look at mod culture, boys and girls dressed largely similarly, had very similar haircuts. The same was true of punk culture as well. And what Resistance Through Rituals argued was that these were not simply stylistic choices, but very visible experiments in new forms of identity that was created by somewhat chaotic post war circumstances. What's this got to do with resistance? Well, what we can say is that these youth subcultures were more or less conscious efforts to write different gender stories. If we look at the punk movement, for example, we can see that the punk movement was very explicit about wanting to break gender stereotypes. We have to understand that the punk culture developed in reaction to a very different form of popular culture that, according to the writer Angela McRobbie at least, very much tried to reinvent conventional forms of femininity. So the sort of popular culture that most girls, most teenage girls in Britain were consuming in the 1970s, represented by the magazine on the left, told them very much that their place was in the home, that their concern should be finding the right boy, dressing appropriately, listening to the right kind of music, and basically learning to be a housewife. And Susie Sue on the right was part of a punk movement that said that we don't have to be any of these things, that there's a different way of being, and that in our music and in the way that we dress, we're going to express what that different way of being is. You've been told that the image on the left is common sense, it's just the way things are. We are here to show you that that is not true. So, resistance through media rituals, resistance through listening to certain kinds of music, dressing in particular ways, wasn't just simply an exercise in pleasure. It was a more or less deliberate attempt to confront existing social and economic arrangements. Social and economic arrangements that had every interest in keeping women in their place, and through which knowing how to use signs, knowing how to listen to the right music and dress in the right way wasn't just a way of having fun, but it was also a way of establishing some kind of control over your identity and giving you a voice in society. So, this is the subtext, I think, behind Velez's work on revenge porn.